An opposition rally disrupted in the northern city of Gulu in December. Such scenes are not new on the campaign trail in Uganda.
We have not done anything wrong.
Of all the candidates, opposition leader Robert Kyagulanyi, also known as Bobi Wine, and his supporters appear to be the most frequently targeted by security forces. But he's not the only one. Some activists have been arrested while others have disappeared.
Political analysts say victory for Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni is all but certain in Thursday's election. That's because of his stranglehold on Ugandan institutions after 4 decades in power. But the vote could nevertheless have important implications for the East African country's future. 81-year-old Museveni is aiming for a 7th term in office. His main challenger is 43-year-old Bobi Wine, a pop star turned politician who is popular with younger voters. Other notable candidates are former parliamentary opposition leader Nandala Mafabi and ex-military chief Mugisha Muntu. Museveni has touted a record of relative peace and stability. He says he wants Uganda to become a middle-income country through manufacturing, agricultural exports and the start of oil production expected later this year. Wine has accused Museveni of 40 years of dictatorship and campaigned on restoring political freedoms. The government has denied allegations of widespread human rights abuses. Wine has also vowed to tackle corruption, bolster youth employment, and review agreements with international oil firms. Successive Ugandan elections have been marred by violence and crackdowns on government opponents. Security forces killed more than 50 people before the last election in 2021. That was amid protests triggered by Wine's arrest. Hundreds of opposition supporters have been detained in the run-up to this year's vote, and at least one killed. While there may be little suspense with regard to the outcome, political observers will still be watching this election. And that's for what it says about succession. Museveni is widely thought to be lining up his son, military chief Muhoozi Kainerugaba, for the top.
Uganda entered a period of acute national tension following the announcement of preliminary presidential election results, as outbreaks of violence were reported in several districts within hours of polling stations closing. What began as scattered demonstrations over alleged irregularities rapidly escalated into deadly confrontations involving civilians, security forces, and organized groups of political supporters. By the end of the first 24 hours, multiple fatalities had been confirmed by hospital officials, local authorities, and independent observers, marking one of the most violent post-election periods in the country's recent history. The election itself had been conducted amid heavy security deployment across major urban centers and opposition strongholds. Military vehicles, armed police patrols, and intelligence units were visible around polling stations in Kampala, Wakiso, Mukono, Masaka, and other politically sensitive regions. The presence of uniformed forces was justified by authorities as a preventative measure to ensure stability, though opposition figures and civil society organizations described the deployment as intimidating and excessive. Reports emerged throughout election day of delayed openings at polling stations, malfunctioning voter identification equipment, and shortages of electoral materials in opposition-leaning areas. As voting concluded and early tallies began circulating, social media and word-of-mouth reports fueled public anger. Allegations of ballot stuffing, voter suppression, and arbitrary arrests of opposition mobilizers spread rapidly, particularly in areas with a history of contested outcomes. Despite the government imposing restrictions on digital platforms and tightening control over communications, images and videos showing clashes between civilians and security personnel surfaced, intensifying public anxiety and distrust. The violence that followed unfolded unevenly across the country. In some districts, crowds gathered peacefully to demand transparency in the vote counting process. In others, confrontations erupted when security forces attempted to disperse protesters using tear gas, batons, and live ammunition. Medical workers in several hospitals reported treating gunshot wounds, blunt force injuries, and cases of severe tear gas exposure. Independent monitors confirmed fatalities among civilians, with conflicting accounts over whether the deaths occurred during protests, arrests, or nighttime security operations. Government officials acknowledged the deaths but attributed responsibility to violent agitators and criminal elements allegedly exploiting post-election uncertainty. Statements released by the security services emphasized the need to maintain law and order and warned against unauthorized gatherings. Curfews were enforced in certain areas, and roadblocks were erected to restrict movement. In contrast, opposition leaders accused the state of using lethal force to silence dissent and consolidate power, insisting that the protests were a response to electoral injustice rather than organized violence. Uganda's political environment has long been shaped by the dominance of President Yoweri Museveni, who has ruled the country for decades following his rise to power in the late 1980s. Over successive election cycles, the political landscape has grown increasingly polarized, with opposition movements gaining support among younger voters, urban populations, and civil society groups. The emergence of opposition leader Bobi Wine, a former musician turned politician, has intensified this generational and ideological divide, turning elections into flashpoints of national confrontation. In the lead-up to the vote, human rights organizations documented arrests of opposition supporters, restrictions on campaign activities, and the disruption of rallies. Journalists reported harassment and temporary detentions, while some media outlets faced warnings or suspension threats for their coverage. The government rejected claims of systematic repression, arguing that security measures were necessary to prevent unrest and protect national stability. These competing narratives deepened mistrust and set the stage for post-election volatility. International observers expressed concern over the deteriorating situation as reports of deaths and mass arrests emerged. Diplomatic missions called for restraint and urged Ugandan authorities to conduct transparent investigations into the violence. Statements from foreign governments emphasized the importance of respecting human rights, protecting civilian lives, and resolving disputes through legal and institutional channels rather than force. The United Nations and regional bodies reiterated their calls for calm, dialogue, and accountability. The economic consequences of the unrest were immediate and visible. Businesses in affected areas closed temporarily, public transport was disrupted, and markets operated under fear of renewed clashes. Investors and analysts warned that prolonged instability could undermine Uganda's economic recovery, disrupt trade routes, and discourage foreign investment. Tourism operators reported cancellations, while local entrepreneurs faced losses due to interrupted supply chains and curfews. Within communities, the violence deepened social divisions. Families mourned lost relatives as conflicting accounts of events circulated. In some neighborhoods, residents accused local authorities of failing to protect civilians, while others blamed protest organizers for escalating tensions. Religious leaders and community elders attempted to mediate, urging youth to avoid confrontation and calling on security forces to exercise restraint. Despite these efforts, fear remained widespread as rumors of further crackdowns persisted. Security operations intensified in the days following the initial violence. House-to-house searches were reported in certain districts, with authorities claiming they were targeting individuals responsible for attacks on police and property. Opposition groups countered that the operations were indiscriminate and aimed at dismantling political networks. Human rights defenders documented cases of arbitrary detention and restricted access to legal representation, raising alarms about due process violations. Uganda's legal framework provides mechanisms for challenging election results through the courts, and opposition leaders announced their intention to pursue legal remedies. However, skepticism remained high regarding the independence and effectiveness of judicial processes, given past rulings that upheld contested outcomes. Many citizens questioned whether legal channels alone could address grievances in an environment marked by force and intimidation. The role of the military in domestic policing became a focal point of debate. Uganda's armed forces have historically been involved in internal security operations, but critics argued that their prominent presence during elections blurred the line between civilian governance and military authority. Supporters of the government maintained that the military's involvement was necessary to prevent chaos and protect critical infrastructure. This debate reflected broader concerns about civil-military relations and democratic governance in the country. As days passed, casualty figures remained contested, with independent verification proving difficult due to restricted access and information controls. Civil society organizations continued to collect testimonies from victims and witnesses, calling for impartial investigations and accountability. Families of the deceased demanded justice, staging quiet vigils and memorials despite the risk of reprisal. Regionally, the situation in Uganda drew attention from neighboring countries concerned about spillover effects. Uganda plays a significant role in East African security and peacekeeping operations, and instability within its borders raised questions about its capacity to maintain regional commitments. Analysts noted that domestic unrest could have implications for refugee movements, cross-border trade, and diplomatic relations within the region. The post-election violence also reignited debates about governance, constitutional reform, and the future of democracy in Uganda. Youth activists and student groups organized discussions, online forums, and small-scale gatherings to debate political change, representation, and civic participation. Many expressed frustration with a political system they perceived as unresponsive to popular will, while others emphasized the risks of confrontation and the need for gradual reform. Media coverage of the crisis varied widely. State-aligned outlets emphasized security concerns and portrayed protests as unlawful disturbances, while independent and international media highlighted civilian casualties and allegations of repression. The divergence in narratives further polarized public opinion and complicated efforts to establish a shared understanding of events. Despite the tension, some efforts at de-escalation emerged. Calls for national dialogue were echoed by religious institutions, professional associations, and elder councils. These groups urged political leaders to prioritize national unity, acknowledge grievances, and commit to peaceful resolution mechanisms. Whether such appeals would translate into concrete action remained uncertain. The deaths that followed the election became a symbol of broader struggles over power, legitimacy, and citizenship in Uganda. For supporters of the opposition, the fatalities represented the cost of demanding democratic accountability. For government loyalists, they were portrayed as tragic but necessary consequences of maintaining order in a volatile environment. Between these positions lay millions of citizens seeking stability, justice, and a future free from fear. As Uganda moved forward from the immediate aftermath, the country faced difficult questions about accountability for the violence, the credibility of its electoral institutions, and the role of security forces in political life. The answers to these questions would shape not only the legacy of the election, but also the trajectory of Uganda's political development in the years ahead. The post-election violence underscored the fragile balance between security and freedom in transitional democracies. It revealed the high stakes of political competition in societies marked by historical grievances, economic inequality, and youthful populations demanding change. Whether the loss of life would prompt meaningful reform or entrench existing divisions remained one of the most pressing uncertainties confronting Uganda.
You've been watching Echoes of Africa, where every story carries the sound of tomorrow. If this moved you, subscribe now, like, and share so Africa's voice never fades into silence.